Agora vamos dar continuidade. Vamos chamar o professor David Adams, dos Estados Unidos. Aposentado da Unesco em 2001, onde exercia a função de diretor da Unidade para o Ano Internacional para a Cultura da Paz, o IYCP, em nome da Unesco. Ele preparou documentos para a ONU, incluindo o projeto de declaração e o programa de ação sobre a cultura da paz em 1999. Durante sua passagem pelas universidades de Wesleyan e Yale, nos Estados Unidos, especializou-se nos mecanismos de comportamento agressivo, a evolução da guerra, a psicologia dos ativistas da paz e ajudou a desenvolver e divulgar a Declaração de Sevilha sobre a violência. Possui várias publicações na área da saúde, principalmente neurociência e comportamento, quais muitas dessas ajudam a estabelecer a base científica para trabalhar em prol da cultura da paz. Vamos receber, portanto, o professor David Adams.
Boa noite. We have very good interpreters, so you will have to listen for Portuguese in your earphone, okay? What is the culture of peace? We have been talking all week about culture of peace. It is not simply peace. It is more than that. But how do we know what is a culture of peace? This was a very big problem for me and my team. In 1999, the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York asked UNESCO to prepare a declaration and program of action on a culture of peace. And this was the task of my team, like you. But not so many people, maybe 10 people, very young, and we had to prepare a document for culture of peace, but we did not know what it is. Because we have never seen a culture of peace. We have always lived in a culture of war. Either there was a war, or we were preparing for another war, or we were recovering for a war, or there was a war between countries, or a war inside the country. You know, in Brazil, you know what I mean, yes? So, to talk about the culture of war is a little bit like talking to a fish about water. You try to explain to a fish what is water. The fish says, I don't know what is water, because everything is water. And certainly we don't know what is a culture of peace. Well, my team and I, we began by trying to analyze what is the culture of war, because that we should know what is the culture of war, okay? Probably if I ask you what is the culture of war, many of you will say it is anger, or it is fear, because you think maybe it is part of human nature. Well, before, as you know, before I worked at the United Nations, I was a scientist, and I studied the brain mechanisms of aggression. Yes, we can become angry. It is part of our nature to become angry, especially against injustice. It is part of our nature to be afraid. But when we brought together scientists from all over the world and we asked them the simple question, is war part of human nature? And we studied this question, we said no. You cannot find war in the genetic code. You cannot find war in the brain. You cannot find war in animals. Some people will tell you that ants have war. If you think ants have war, talk to me afterwards and I will explain to you that the ant is only one cell of a colony, which is the one organism, because everything is the queen. That's one colony. So you have, it's like saying that your white cells make war when they go through your body and they kill the germs. No, that's not war. So we ended our declaration in 1986, the Declaration of Seville, by saying, we used the words of the anthropologist Margaret Mead. War was an invention, a cultural invention. And the same species that invented war is able to invent peace. But we have to invent peace. It will not come without being invented. So, the culture of war is not anger, it is not fear, okay? What is it? Usually I have more time. Usually we do this together, but tonight we only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to be very fast, okay? Okay, so it's very clear that the culture of war must include armas, soldados, okay, it's clear, simply, and you must have enemigos. Very simple. No enemy, no war. You cannot have war without an enemy. Very famous story. Gorbachev told President Reagan at the end of the Cold War, I'm going to do something terrible to you. Reagan said, what are you going to do? Gorbachev said, I am going to take away your enemy. Oh my God. What will happen to America with no enemy? And so immediately they began working and working and working, and a special group at Harvard said, yes, Islam. We have an enemy. Oh, good. Because we can keep going, we have an enemy. You have to have at least some authoritarian structure. Otherwise, no one will follow orders. What if they give orders and no one obeys? You cannot make a war if no one obeys orders. Okay? Simple. This is very important. Secrets. Secrets. You must have secrets in the culture of war. Because the enemy must not know what you are doing. And by the way, over the course of the history of the culture of war, it's more than secrets, it's control of information in general. So now, more and more, the culture of war is the control of information, propaganda, deciding what people should know and what they should not know, and what they should consider to be news. Very simple, it is men that make war and not women. This is the domination of men. From the beginning of prehistory, since men have the means of violence, they're dominated. So then becomes the state is dominated by men, then religions are dominated by men, enterprises are dominated by men, and so the domination of men has changed all of history. By the way, it is not biological, it is cultural. It's too long to spend the time on why it has happened, but it's related to war. Of course, war has been very successful. Why? Because after the state was invented, war became very useful for the taking of slaves, for taking of colonies, for imperial power, and it's very profitable. Very profitable. If you don't have the culture of war, you're poor. If you have a good culture of war, you become very rich. These are empires. At the same time, there is destruction of the environment by the culture of war. And finally, the culture of war is supported by education. If you study history, what do you study? You study the history of wars. You study that the great people are men and they're military leaders. Okay, so this is the culture of war. What is the culture of peace? Let's simply make the opposite, okay? We go from culture of war. So, instead of armaments, armas, soldados, we have disarmament. Instead of having enemies, we have solidarity, tolerance with other peoples. Instead of authoritarianismo, we have participação democrática, democratic participation. Instead of secrets and propaganda, we have the free flow of information, free circulation of information. Instead of the domination of men, we have equality of men and women. Instead of exploitation, and of course it's not only travels, but exploitation of people, of countries, etc. We have human rights for everyone. Instead of exploitation of the environment, we have sustainable development. And finally, instead of education for a culture of war, okay, educação para a cultura da guerra, and here we have educação para a cultura da paz, okay? So, here we have the Declaration and Program of Action of the United Nations, which was adopted in 1999. This was adopted, this is like the Declaration of Human Rights, it's a United Nations decision. But, a problem. The European Union looked at this. They said, no, you cannot talk about cultura de guerra. No. So the European Union said, all of this has to be taken out because you cannot talk about this. So if you look at the final resolution, it only has this, it only has half, not the other half. But, so I go around and I say to people, you have this, but don't forget it comes from this. Okay, why did the European Union say you cannot talk about this? Why do you think? Because if we begin to talk too much about the culture of war, people will say, we don't want this. And that will take away the power of the states. And the member states control the United Nations. And then there's one other aspect. We said that the culture of war is not only between countries, but inside a country, like the dictatorships. You recognize this as a dictatorship. Yeah. We have to have an enemy. Of course, when you were in Brazil, it was communists, trade unionists, people working for human rights. I don't have to tell you about authoritarianism, right? I don't have to tell you about secrets, about domination of men. I don't have to tell you about this. You know about this. But in the United Nations, in the Charter of the United Nations, it says the United Nations cannot talk about the internal affairs of a member state. The way the United Nations is now, cannot talk about this, either external or internal. Why? Because it is run by the member states. I just finished a book, finished 3 books, but one of the books I just finished is the history of the culture of war. And one thing I see throughout the history of the culture of war is that the history of the state is that over time, the state has come to monopolize the culture of war. For a new state, maybe there are some tribes or some groups making war. No, you have to pacify them because only the state has the right to kill. Only the state can have this power. This is to the point that the great sociologist Max Weber, how many of you heard of Max Weber, sociologist? Okay. Anyone who has studied sociology knows about Max Weber. They asked Max Weber, what is the definition of the state? And he said, very simple. The state is the organization that has a monopoly of violence on its territory. Period. The state is the organization with a monopoly of violence on its territory. And what is the definition of a failed state? Like, for example, Afghanistan, Somalia, and so forth. A failed state is very simply a state that has lost the monopoly on violence. Very simple. So, we must come to a very simple and a very radical conclusion. That if the United Nations is to make peace, the United Nations must be run directly by the people and not by the states. So you will say to me, this is impossible. How can you say the United Nations can be run directly by the people and not by the states? Sounds very impossible, yes? But I have an experience that probably none of you have had. I have seen clearly how the culture of war is not sustainable. And after time, the culture of war always crashes. I have seen this because I speak Russian, and I worked in the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 1980s as a scientist. And I watched how an empire crashes. It crashes from inside. And I've done the analysis of how it crashed. Most people don't want to talk about this anymore to say, why did it crash? But you can make the analysis of why it crashed. And now I see exactly the same things happening for the American empire and the globalized economy, which is related to the American empire. Now, when the system crashes, last time, for example, like it crashed in 1929, 1932, there is a certain moment when it would be possible to say, okay, the people of the world will say, okay, the states, you have had your turn at the United Nations, now we will run the United Nations directly. And if the people ran the United Nations, this is what the people, if you were running the United Nations, this is what you would want. But if we wait for the crash, and then we say, oh, now let's run the United Nations, it will be too late. It will be too late. Hold on. Do we have something to write? Yeah. John, you will help me. So, we have to think about how do we prepare. How do we prepare for a transition of the United Nations to being run directly by the people? What do we need to do to prepare for such a possibility? Think about it yourself, and think of at least one thing we need to do now to begin preparing so that when the system crashes, we can say we want a new system where the United Nations works under our direction and works for a culture of peace. We don't give it to anybody else. We take charge as the people of the world, and we say we want a culture of peace. Think about what do we need to prepare. How can we make a preparation for this? How can we build a system which could now run the United Nations directly from the people, not through the state? I don't care whether the state continues or not, okay. I don't care if there's still armies. Let the armies take care of refugees, and they should repair the dikes in New Orleans so that the dikes don't break. We'll always have work for the Army to do, but we need a new system that says to the United Nations, we will tell you what to do. And I can tell you, there are good people in the United Nations. If the United Nations, when I was working in the United Nations, we had wonderful people. If only the orders that came to us were good, we could have done culture of peace. Okay, so give me some suggestions. I want some suggestions. How can we prepare? Alicia Cavazzullo has an idea.
Education.
Education. So, that's what we are doing tonight, yes? I think this is education. Would you agree? Okay, so this is education, and we are starting to prepare through education. Magnus Hamilton. Parliamentary Assembly. So in other words, we would start to have new democratic forms. New democratic forms that don't pass through the state, but come directly from the people. Okay, give me some other ideas. One of them I like very much is from Brazil, okay? And it's like education, but it's the word of Paulo Freire, which I have a hard time to say. It's conscientization.